close to the Zapatista movement since the 1994. And also, I was in a project of called Autonomy that studied the processes of 6 countries in Latin America, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Brazil. So from this experience in the Zapatista movement and in the autonomy project, I would like to introduce you to this PowerPoint. In this PowerPoint, you have it's a kind of two voices concert, because you are going to see this with quotation marks that's notes of a course called Freedom According to the Zapatistas. So we were to classes like another student or a student, and this was called La Escuelita, that is a small school in Spanish. So what I wanted to do here is, from one hand, that you can read what the Zapatistas think of themselves, and then what I am going to talk about them. So what is this indigenous government? You have to understand this in the historical context that we are living in Latin America, especially in Mexico, that is an occupied country by the transnational and by neoliberalism. So in this context, the self-government is a struggle of the original peoples to preserve and to their territorial and cultural integrity and their natural resources through organizational forms based on the practice of a participative democracy that confronts, by means of an anti-systemic strategy, the rapacity and violence of capitalism in this current transnational neoliberal phase. They are peoples that reclaim their origin and identity, that is not the national majority, that are considered themselves like Mexicanos or Mexicans. And these peoples have formed as an autonomous subjects in the desire to imprint a sense of community in their lives. In these times where egoism, individualism, and competitivity is aimed to displace solidarity, dignity, and fraternity. Particularly, capitalists introducing the young people of our countries this what I call the generation that think in themselves only. And that is something that we have to deal with. The indigenous self-government of Latin America are conceived as political, territorial spaces where the oppressed can consolidate their communitarian expression of direct democracy in the local, regional, and even national arenas. Based on this premise, self-government are considered forms of resistance and of conformation of an autonomous subject which is constituted as an interlocutor that negotiates with the state when negotiation can take place. Simultaneously, if this fails, as in the case of Mexico, de facto self-governments are then established. Not only in the Zapatistas cases, but we have these processes going on in other parts of the country. Hence, self-governments are not granted at all, but rather conquered through organization and awareness and through hard-fought uprising and extensive mobilizations like this. Self-governments are not considered libertarian island within the capitalist universe. In a video, the Zapatistas pointed out clearly, ours is not a liberated territory, not a utopian commune. It is not an experimental laboratory of nonsense or a paradise of the orphaned left, not at all. The indigenous people do not disseminate an idyllic imagine of their movement, assuming that these groups progress by jumping over all obstacles. That was a critique that appears to be founded on a lack of empirical research. Many analysts talk about the Zapatistas without being there or without knowing them. And of course, they do not analyze the indigenous autonomy in the process itself. What is this autonomous subject? Theoretically speaking, but we can find this empirically too, must be representative of the general interests of the communities, must have a defined territorial base and a socio-ethnic identity. In the case of Zapatistas, there is a multi-ethnic processes. They are Maya, but from different, even language. So you have Sal, Sotil, Tojolabal. Must be rooted in a communal foundation based on regional and supra-regional identities. In other words, what we call democratic communitarism. John will talk about the Rojava example, but in this case, and in the case of Rojava, I think, is this democratic communitarism must be constituted as a legitimate and recognized interlocutor in negotiation with the states. The Zapatistas process covers a broad scope in the formation of this subject, extending beyond the political military organization. We highlight the dynamic, transformative nature of the processes that make up the autonomous indigenous governments. For in order to become such governments, they must modify participation in diversity of dimension. For example, the relationship between genders. They have a revolutionary law for the woman since before the revolt in 1994. Also, this movement have changed the relation between generations. In this case, they insisted in the protagonism of women and youth. In March 6, the Zapatistas have a meeting with around 8,000 women from 48 countries, and it was a very interesting encounter over there. And this process also democratized the indigenous societies. It's not a society seen as a traditional one, but as a dynamic one, and politicize and innovate their political and socio-cultural structures. The importance of women participating in the different levels and spaces of community and municipal life is emphasized, particularly as concerns decision-making bodies. I think that is also a characteristic of Rojava process and the exercise of the indigenous self-governments in the effort to achieve a more just and equitable society, developing concrete actions to combat all kinds of violence against indigenous women. The study of contemporary indigenous governments in Latin America, particularly Mexico, from a comprehensive and comparative perspective, reveals this transformative nature of these processes, not only in their articulation, more often than not at odds with the existing national state, but also within the organization of the autonomous subjects themselves. Therefore, it not only has to do with the existence of traditional indigenous self-governments that developed in diverse forms through the colony that was called the Republic of Indians, or in the independent life. And that continued to this day in many communities in the Latin America geography. So what I am saying here is that it's not the traditional self-government that we know. It's another kind of process going on. Nor is it about the power and attribution established at the top, administratively, or because a constitutional modification. Floor and ceilings of models that do not correspond to the concrete realities and that convey the limitation of a social science that lags far behind social ethnic processes. I am saying this because the Zapatista movement demonstrates the limitation of anthropology, for example. And the processes were more rich than the science itself. So we were short and we came late to explain these processes, as happened in many places of the world. Current autonomous practice transcend further. For example, when the Zapatistas moved beyond traditional self-government and undertake them based on the 7 principles of leading by obeying, these principles are very important. And they are not only an ethical and moral principle, but it's the principle for a good form of government. To serve, not to self-serve, to represent, not to replace, to construct, not to destroy, to obey, not command, propose, not impose, convince, not defeat, work from below and not seek to rise. And in addition, we have the rotation of the role of authority. They are changing all the time. You can be 4 months in one commission and 6 months in another. You can be at the level of the municipality and then to the level of the regional governments. So all the times, the people are changing. In that respect, there is no way to have a bureaucracy. There is not a professional politician over there that knows everything, but it's the people themselves that everybody has a responsibility in these processes. So there is no possibility of the form of bureaucracy in these governments. So they have planned and they programmed the participation of women and youth, the equitable and sustainable reorganization of the economy, the adoption of anti-capitalist and anti-systemic political identity. That is the importance of these new forms of government, and the search for national and international alliance. For example, I was telling John the importance of the alliance between the Kurdish movement and the Zapatista movement, while transforming the indigenous people themselves through the regional appropriation of the territory and the station of power from the bottom. To govern autonomously in 30 municipalities, in linking them to the 5 good government councils, juntas de buen gobierno, establishing Oventic, La Realidad, La Garucha, Roberto Barrios, and Morelia, reveals an organizational experience of government that must be taken up pedagogically by other indigenous people. The use of English is also a form of colonization for us. We have to speak English instead of we can talk in our language. The autonomous municipalities and the good government council form part of the best democratic tradition of the Mexican people today, and are a required reference when speaking of democratic governability. For example, this quotation talks about the government destroyed the schools, so they said you can. It did not dismantle our hearts because the school can be in the air and in any place. So they destroyed the school, but is the meaning of this sentence. In the case of the Zapatista, and in most of those studies in Latin America, we have proven that interference of political parties of the bourgeois democratic system deteriorates autonomous governments and even causing them to fail. The Indians said to this that the party cut the communities, divided the communities. In Mexico, for many years, the Indians were a reservoir of votes that the official party, you know that we have about 70 years of a regimen of party system, the PRI, imposed to the indigenous chiefdoms, caciques we call in Spanish, is seriously affected by an indigenous movement that frontally rejects the current system of the state parties and questions the deteriorating components of a managed democracy, imposing in his stead another collective way of carrying out politics. So we have another form of make politics. Representative democracy is the only democracy possible when rooted in the racist and ethnocentric national society that denies all the experience of direct democracies in the indigenous communities, which develop a political culture founded on resistance and the bedrock of the current autonomous process. The Zapatist experience and the experience of other processes in Latin America show that the development of a consolidated multi-ethnic network of autonomous governments of communities and regions, and even of diverse people, is another one of the transcendent change in the current condition of autonomous governments, where intra-community struggles due to secular conflicts, boundaries, or resources can be overcome to respond in a united way to the violent intrusion of the states and capitalist corporations and counterinsurgency and organized crime. Let me tell you that in Mexico, as in many parts of Latin America, organized crimes and government is almost the same. And so we have, as in the case of Mexico, a criminal states, and they have, as a matter of fact, they have dos brazos armados, camarada, David, ¿cómo dices dos brazos armados? Two
armed bandits.
Yeah.
Two armed bandits.
Yeah. So, for one hand, they have the official army forces, police, and secret police, and everything. And on the other hand, they have the organized crime that are political active, defending the capitalist enterprise. We have to conceptualize organized crime as another corporative threat to our territory. So it's not another explanation for this. There is not at all. All of the internal transformation, ruptures, and redefinition of the communitary, regional, and national arenas are impossible without the consolidation of the autonomous subject. I give enormous importance to this concept of autonomous subjects, which makes self-government possible with inward hegemonic affirmation capacities, so that they contribute to internal cohesion and through the construction of consensus, participatory democracy, tolerance, and the overcoming of religious, ethnic, and political division, the fight against corruption and against co-optation attempts by the state and his agents. The subjects, these autonomous subjects, incites the mobilization of people and communities to defend their rights and demands, and is supported by legitimate outward representation. Contemporary autonomous indigenous governments are far from the stereotype of autarky that their adversaries predicted as inherent to this phenomenon. On the contrary, as is observed in many Latin American countries, the eruption of indigenous people into the political events of their respective nation is a reality. The process proposed substantial change in the very nature of this nation as plurinational, pluriethnic, pluricultural, and plurilinguistic entities, and reaffirm the indigenous as political subjects with a collective rights as people and nationalities. The autonomous Zapatista governments are responsible for justice, for security, for education, for health and culture, and maintain their authority at the community, municipal, and regional levels, reaffirming the value and importance of political practice that materialize in community assemblies, role system, rotation systems, the tequio, that is a free word for the community, and in general, community obligation and contributions. Let me tell you that the Zapatista, the military organization of the Zapatistas removed all his professional soldiers, to say, from the governments, expressing the desire that the government were something of the civil society and not from the organization. It's the first case in Latin America in which a guerrilla do not take the power from themselves. Yeah? On the other way, they put the power in the people. They abandon this representation. So this emphasizes the place and on the importance of the articulation and interaction of indigenous communities and municipalities for the exercise of autonomy at the regional level, as guaranteed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and also in the San Andres Agreement of 1996, that was an agreement between the federal government and the Zapatista movement. This LAT autonomy project maintains one of the hypotheses. When we work at 10 hypotheses, I'm not going to tie it with the 10, but this hypothesis is the hypothesis of network, and says this hypothesis: the sustainability of an autonomous system depends in his ability to link the level of local communities with a regional structure in a horizontal and interactive manner through a process of integration from below. Political self-government and participatory economic structures must be created that are articulated both inwardly in the multicultural autonomies and outwardly generating an alternative society project. This hypothesis is against any ethnocentric localism and against the hierarchical representation that prevent the development of participatory mechanisms in political decision making. Equally, the hypothesis of balance in the autonomy projects affirms in an autonomic system, which is a social process from which a new political subject emerges, there must be a balance between the political judicial dimension, the cultural intercultural dimension, and the economic ecological dimension. If an autonomic process is lacking in any of these dimensions or overreaching in another, there is a risk of external actors, national state, landowners, transnational companies, penetrate this system, subverting it from within and destroy the process. So this is the hypothesis of balance. Also, to think of autonomous governments and the relationship with Latin American national states implies for indigenous and not indigenous movements a theoretical and political responsibility with the national and anti-capital resistance, in the case of Latin America, to the hemispheric project that the United States and his allies, European allies and local allies, intended to continue imposing in the continent in the new expression of the globalization of capital. Latin America is being affected by projects, agreements, and regional programs of United States origin, such as SPAN and the Colombia Plan, the Merida Initiative, the American Command, the South Command and the North Command, and various free trade agreements, as well as the corporate invasion in his different economical, political, cultural, military, economical modalities that form part of this new global configuration that has brought with it transnational globalization and huge obstacles for the development of self-governments of indigenous people and citizenships. The so-called New World Order that emerged, among other factors, from the crisis of the real socialist and Keynesian economic models in capitalist countries, not only redefine the spheres of influence and intervention between the countries of the North and the South, formerly called developing countries, but also between the countries of the North themselves. The European Union and his predecessor, the European Economic Community, as well as the North America Free Trade Agreement, emerged as paradigms of a new regional restructuring of capital. This is modified, at least in Latin America. the redefinition of the essence of the national state involved. I think the national state do not disappear at all. They change the role. Today, the role of the national state is to be the manager of capital, the representative of the corporation life, like in the case of Mexico, that represents, for example, the mining corporation, Canadian Mining Corporation, Coca-Cola, and all these corporation, and represent also the kind of organized corporation. Fundamental concept of the national states, such as sovereignty and independence, have been placed in tenterhooks by the current economic model, and indigenous people are contributing to envisioning transformation and effective forms of defense of national sovereignties. It's a paradoxical situation in which the Indian movements are the ones who are defending sovereignty and independence because they fight against the American corporation. Thus, the scope and the role of autonomous government in Latin American countries have also been affected by this global reconfiguration of capital and its borders. In fact, the coordination through which current discussion about autonomous government must analyze how the hemispheric domination project of the United States, first in his Obama and now Trump variants, intends to obstruct and even annihilate, destroy the existence of this government as possible expression of cultural, political, economic, and administrative resistance. Even the intelligent organism considered the indigenous as enemies of the United States, as you can see in Global Trends, this page of Global Trends that formulate what are the threats for the national American interests, and they put the Indian movements between the enemies of the national security of the United States. Nonetheless, in the case of Mexico, the struggle for autonomous governments is a part of a national project that has been developing over many decades of exclusion, misery, and discrimination against indigenous people. These self-governments are part of a national project in which the autonomous subjects have sought integration with other sectors of Mexican society. Specifically, the Zapatistas has addressed students, peasants, workers, housewives, intellectuals, small entrepreneurs, wage earners, professionals, and of all races, all religions, and all ethnic groups to form a different nation where, as they say, all words fits. They do not vindicate self-determination to give continuity to the structural marginalization with colonial and functional roots in the neoliberal globalization. The demands of self-government and self-determination are ways to achieve greater democracy, gender equality, to fight discrimination, to become integrated into an equitative market where indigenous people can freely sell their products and where they are considered citizens and recognized as political subjects able to participate in national processes. Consequently, autonomous governments are the expression of an alternative rethinking of national forms imposed from above by oligarchies groups based on integrationism and assimilationism, or on differentialism and segregationism, which constitute equally provocative ethnocide policies and the denial of citizen rights to groups of indigenous people and communities. In this way, governments are processes of democratization, national articulation, and political coexistence from below between heterogeneous groups in their ethnic, linguistic, cultural composition. Because of his anti-systemic nature and the indigenous presence in territories ambitioned by the capital, in addition to the characteristic of current globalization, self-governments directly or indirectly confront the state, his institutions, and repressive forces, and also counter-insurgent strategies. The political, ideological, military, and intelligence structure of imperialism, his economic corporation, including organized crime, which seeks to open territories, occupy them, appropriate their cultural, natural, and strategic resources, and religious domination, parties, and political mechanisms aim to penetrate mediating and destroying self-governments and collective forms of decision and organization. Hence, the precariousness and the constant struggle to survive and develop to extend his level of inter-community, municipal, regional, and national articulation, as well as to expand the areas of international resistance, solidarity, and coordination are characteristics of this process. It should also be noted that these autonomies do not establish a regime or a new level of government in all cases, with the exception of Nicaragua, in which the Constitution recognized this regime. They do not create corporate rights of privilege or reservation, nor do they identify autonomous territories or administrative division of specific territories in the national geography, as in the case of Nicaragua or in the Spanish state. In the case of Mexico specifically, the San Andres Agreements recognize the right of the people to autonomy within the framework of the Mexican state, and consequently establish the internal competencies of the indigenous authorities, their obligation in the exercise of their competence, and the share and or exclusive obligation of the federal, state, and municipal governments. However, the legal framework do not recognize the communitary and the regional levels of government. The forms of political organization of direct democracy and self-government arise from indigenous autonomic process cannot be applied as a formula for organizing national society and state in its multiple spheres and complexities. However, it is precisely the absence of society and the labor in the exercise of power and state control which characterize and in part quashed the experience of real socialism. In highlighting the participation of all the people in local, municipal, and zonal governments or good governance council, as for example in the case of the Zapatistas, the intention is not to generalize or idealize these forms of self-government given their limitation and the obstacles imposed by the counterinsurgency and the neoliberal expropriation. However, his existence in the Zapatista space is a reality that must prompt an analysis to conceive forms of citizen and popular organization and participation that can substitute the bureaucratic machinery that ignores the mandates of the majority. In this sense, how detrimental can it be in the struggle for the construction of socialism to defend self-organization and highlight solidarity and communitarian values? In the case of the Maya Zapatistas in particular, no apology is given for their experience, nor it is proposed as a model to follow. in the edification of the current and future society. Indigenous self-government do not ignore the state nor the power that it exerts based on the monopoly of violence, legalized by the legal framework legitimized by a class hegemony. This is the handover. This text was written by the Subcomandante Marcos when he died, metaphorically speaking. And he reborn with the name of Galiano. And he said, what are the changes in these 20 years that have of the Zapatistas? And he said that there are multiple and complex handovers in the Zapatistas. Some as a result of the most obvious reason, the generational. You can see in the pictures, all are young. Many of them was born in the Zapatistas revolt. Now those who were very young or were born during the uprising are the ones who are fighting and leading the resistance. But some researchers have not noticed the other handovers, those of class, from the Enlightenment middle class to the indigenous peasant. That means that the mestizo middle class leadership of the Zapatista changed, and now the director of the military organization is an indigenous and not Marcos or Galiano. And the most important, the handover of thought from the revolutionary vanguardism of leading by obeying, from the taking over of power to the creation of power at the bottom, from professional politics to daily politics, from the leaders to the people, from the marginalization of the gender to the direct participation of women, from the mockery of the other to the celebration of difference. It is our conviction, our practice that we do not need leaders or warlords or messiahs or cyborgs to rebel and fight. We need only a bit of shame, a bit of dignity, and a lot of organization. And instead of dedicating ourselves, Marcos said or Galiano said, to forming guerrillas, soldiers, and squadrons, we prepare education and help promoters, and we began to build the basis of an autonomy that amazes the world today. Thank you very much.